I think it's emblematic of something that we see throughout our history, and that is that there are opportunities that each of us as a fellow citizen will have to either be able to stand up for other people with whom we strongly disagree or not. And that is anecdotal in some ways. The Flushing Remonstrance is anecdotal. It isn't a great moment in American history. But in other respects, it stands in for all the moments of American history with respect to our mutual appreciation of religious liberty. When you think about what those people in Flushing, it looked a little different then than it does today. But one thing about Flushing was the same. Today, we have a lot of diversity in Flushing. And you had some then too, because those who were accommodating the Quakers were not Quakers. And they had a lot of cost to themselves for the desire to make life a little bit easier for Quakers. The fact that they were willing to stand up and say, it's our right to be able to accommodate their rights, even when they knew that the likely outcome was going to be bleak, and it was, is an example of the spirit of true religious liberty that we're called to, and that in our history sometimes we reach and sometimes we don't. When the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, when the Mormons were founded, there were similar opportunities for those who thought that is a strange religion. It's the way people thought about the Quakers. That's a strange way to be Christian. And certainly the Mormons gave those who are traditional Protestants in Western Illinois or New York or Missouri a lot to think about. And the opportunities were either to try to accommodate and to allow them to flourish or not. And usually the not part came into effect, which is why the migration happened the way that it happened. But you can kind of recognize in that it isn't a perfect straight line from an era in which we didn't have any respect for religious toleration. Oh, and then Flushing happened. And look, then the light came out. And everyone started to respect each other, and it's continued in an unbroken line all the way up to the present. Well, no, that was actually a high point in some ways, and we had ups and downs, and the experience that the Mormons had probably reflects an opportunity in which they wish that they had been in the company of people in Flushing 2 centuries earlier, as opposed to some of what they actually experienced, which caused them to go off into the desert and form a new state. The Mormons had some supporters, but not enough to be able to avoid having to travel out into the desert. And that's, I think, when you imagine the governor of Missouri sending the troops after you, or your leader being imprisoned in the Carthage jail, and what was the largest city in Illinois, Nauvoo, having to be abandoned. I know that there's a lot of complications in it, because the Quakers certainly were not a threat to anyone in Flushing the way that people perceived the Mormons might be. They were accumulating massive amounts of property and wealth and political power in Western Illinois, a larger population center than Chicago was at that time, and that probably did feel threatening. And that's honestly one other aspect of religious liberty that has to be considered, and that is it's a lot easier to tolerate someone with their diverse religious perspectives when you don't think that they're much of a threat to you. There was nobody in Missouri in the 1840s who was saying, oh, but wait, haven't you read the First Amendment? Well, everybody knew what the First Amendment was, it just didn't have any effect. The governor of Missouri, the legislature of Missouri, the militias of Missouri didn't think that the First Amendment did anything to restrain them, and it didn't. The Supreme Court, only 1 decade before that, in a case called Barron versus Baltimore, said First Amendment applies only to Congress. And so that's why you can see the people in Missouri never talking about the First Amendment. The Mormons were not invoking the First Amendment per se. They were invoking something deeper and more ancient than that, and that is their right to practice their religion. But it was up to Missouri law to be able to decide whether to protect it or not for another century. James Madison was one of our great independent thinkers. and he was able to perceive things and see them through eyes that were a little different than most of his contemporaries in Virginia. For example, with respect to the Baptists, they were being treated rather abominably in ways that we would regard as shocking. People who were literally being imprisoned, and sometimes the charge was that you couldn't go near them without them inserting a verse of scripture down your throat. And that doesn't seem like something that's such a shocking idea to us, but it was to most Virginians of the day, with its established church, the parson, the Anglican minister who would receive money and support from the farmers and the population. To have these upstart Baptists suddenly appear after many, many decades of real hegemony by the dominant Anglican, the Church of England, the Episcopalian tradition today. And James Madison is able to see with eyes that are more like those of a future generation, and to say the idea that we would imprison them or punish them, harass them, intimidate them for doing nothing more than peaceably proclaiming what they believe to be the gospel of Jesus Christ is a shocking and astonishing thing that is beneath the dignity of a free people. And so he, despite not being a Baptist himself, having no real personal desire to be anything other than the elite, Montpelier living Madison that he was, nonetheless was able to recognize that Virginia owed to all of its people the respect and dignity that they were owed as Virginians, including the ability to be something as crazy as a Baptist. People did recognize that there were big social changes that were happening as the Baptists were starting to flourish. And it really seemed like it came out of nowhere, I think, to many people. They were used to having the Anglican tradition, and there were some Presbyterians out to the west, and then suddenly, almost out of nowhere and almost overnight, Baptists started springing up, and they were very evangelical. Their whole method of propagating the gospel was to do things that were calculated, or at least so it seemed to most Virginians, to take away those that ought to have been deep within the established church and bring them to the Baptists instead. And you can imagine how scary that would be for those who depended upon the established way of doing things. What I think is interesting about Madison is that he was able to actually isolate the religious side of it and to say it doesn't really matter that much about what's happening in these other categories. Most of us think about life as one big collective whole. He was able to realize the religious liberty that the Baptists have is such an important part of the dialogue that we have to continue, that he could actually focus on that and take out of his view all of the consequences that were economic and political that might have seemed so undesirable to other people. Whenever you start to enumerate rights, if you really believe that people have a lot of rights, you're worried, because the more that you actually express, the easier it is for people to conclude, well, they've made their list, and if the right that you want isn't on it, you don't have it. And so the idea that we would have a Bill of Rights in the national Constitution implies powers of the federal government that I don't think that a lot of the framers really wanted to assume existed in the first place. And so if you really believed in the federal government, if you're James Madison, some of the other framers of the Constitution, and you think that what you're doing is something that will unite the states into one people, and yet it isn't going to be a big threat to the liberties of the people, then there's no need to have a Bill of Rights, and in fact there might be danger in having it. But of course, that wasn't the way that so many of the people in the country saw things. And so Madison was particularly well equipped to be able to pivot and to recognize, all right, if the success of the federal project is going to require that we have a Bill of Rights, even though I didn't think it was necessary, now that I'm persuaded that we have to have it in order for it to be successful, we can elevate the rights of conscience, a free exercise of religion, and that is consistent with the approach he had taken in Virginia to protecting the Baptists. He ensured that, at least from the level of the federal government, there would be no threat because of the textual promise to the free exercise of religion on the part of all Americans. And that was something that I think made a big difference to the people of Virginia. I know that there were Baptist leaders, for example, who were desperate to try to win representation in Congress. And when they talked to James Madison and realized he was willing to champion religious liberty in that way, to ensure that the federal government would not infringe it, they got behind him and said, we've got to support Madison and get him into Congress, and then the rest is history. We, in the 21st century, are so focused on the role, the pervasive role that the federal government and the federal courts play in our lives to define and circumscribe the constitutional rights that each of us regards as fundamental. And the state legislatures, the state constitution, and the state courts sometimes take a back seat in our analysis and thinking and news coverage today, but it was exactly the opposite at the time the Constitution was framed. The need for the Bill of Rights was actually to preserve the primacy of the states in terms of defining the rights of each state's people. And so the protection in the First Amendment, which begins with Congress shall make no law, was designed to ensure that whatever the states were going to do, even without the federal Constitution, they'd continue to be able to do without interference from Congress. But that's a negative protection. Congress shall make no law doesn't say much about what a state would do back in the 18th and 19th centuries. And so we do, you're right, we talk about the First Amendment as if it's shorthand for religious liberty itself. But for most of our country's history, religious liberty was protected only by state law, by state tradition, by state constitutions, state legislatures, and state courts. And that's because the First Amendment was only held to apply to the federal government and to restrict it well until the 20th century, when the Supreme Court looked at the 14th Amendment following the Civil War and decided that it incorporated the Bill of Rights, or most of the Bill of Rights, against the states. You don't look at American history and think, my goodness, back in the bulk of our past, when the First Amendment did not apply against state governments, there was no religious freedom in America. The opposite is true. All of the states had guarantees of religious liberty that, like anything else, had their ups and their downs, their evennesses and unevennesses. But state law was able to give the measure of religious liberty that has become what we're accustomed to and we often describe as First Amendment rights. And the second thing I'll say is that state law, state constitution, state courts remain important today. And so here we are in the Supreme Court of Texas, and we are indeed bound by the First Amendment. All of us who are state judges take an oath that we will follow the Constitution of the United States. And the Constitution of the United States is now held to ensure that the First Amendment applies just as much against the actions of the government of Texas as of the government of the United States. But we still have the Texas Constitution, and we still have Texas statutory protections of religious liberty that we can first look to, if necessary, when someone brings to us a case about their rights to be able to exercise their religious beliefs freely. And that is something that links our entire history together. And the fact that the majority of our history was only the work of the states that protected religious liberty in a meaningful way is something that often is forgotten but shouldn't be. It's an important part of understanding the larger superstructure of constitutional law in this country. It's interesting that when you think about the Jehovah's Witnesses, you might first go and think about their oddity from the perspective of the dominant religious tradition. And the idea that there would be people, especially when we're in the midst of an international crisis, where it's especially important that we have young men leaving the country to be able to go and defend the values that the country stands for, and then to have others who are going to say, I won't even say the pledge to the flag, while others are out there fighting and dying underneath it. You can understand, and it's something that hasn't entirely gone away, that discordant note would affect the way people would approach them. On the other hand, bring back in the notion that this is not a powerful sect that was about to seize political power, that was about to destroy the political community the way that maybe people thought that the Mormons were going to do a century earlier in Illinois or Missouri as they accumulated numbers and land and voters. And so it was a clash, really, of important ideas. One, the desire that does spring so quickly to the human heart to suppress dissent when it's something that we care so deeply about. But secondly, the ability, particularly when the threat of someone being able to take our stuff or take our power, when that's removed, more quickly we're able to see the value in protecting dissenters' rights. And it's interesting that the Supreme Court did have that 1-2 reaction. They first responded in a way that protected the majoritarian sentiment, the idea that we were going to be able to insist upon the majority's power to compel compliance with certain norms, but then a second thought, which is something that maybe is a beautiful look at how we can do things in this country. We can have a second thought, and we don't have to stand on our first instinct. And that second thought here was to say, this is not harming anyone except for them if we don't allow them to be able to act in accordance with their religious principles. To me, it has a very personal meaning, and I think to a lot of Americans throughout our history it does, which should perhaps explain why some of the responses that we have, ranging from how the Englishmen in Flushing responded to the Quakers, all the way to how we address new or unfamiliar religious practice today. And to me, religious liberty is important because I know that I am not going to be able to answer for anyone else when the day comes and we all confront our Creator. I believe that that day will come. I really do. And I know that nobody else can answer for me either. And if that's true, and if I want to be able to account for myself without anybody else being able to say, oh, well, don't blame him. I had passed this law that stopped him from doing the acts of worship that he regarded as important or necessary. I know that they have to be able to make an account of themselves as well. I think throughout our entire law, throughout our entire history, there has been that aspect of religious freedom. Not the idea that necessarily someone loves that someone else has a vastly different religious outlook than their own, but instead the recognition that that person is going to be accountable one day. And for that reason, it's important that we have a legal superstructure that doesn't impede that person's ability in what will be likely a much longer period than the 70, 80 years of life we have in this country to answer for themselves. If we are a country built on the idea of self-government and the consent of the governed, the idea that you and I are going to participate in determining the destiny of our country, we can't trust each other to participate in self-government if we can't trust each other to govern ourselves with respect to our religious perspectives and duties and practices. And so the first liberty that we have to have is that duty to our Creator. And if we can trust each other to do that, then we can trust each other to responsibly participate in the mutual goal of governing the entire country. Well, I think I would talk to them about the rest of the rights that follow in the Constitution and in daily life. And that is that once you pick off what to so many people is the most fundamental liberty of all, the liberty of conscience and the ability to decide what obligations you have to something larger than yourself, or to decide that there is nothing larger than yourself. But once you're willing to take that away from someone, what other rights are going to be protected? Because that one is so fundamental to our history and to the idea of one's own identity that if, because we don't believe in religion, we're perfectly willing to wipe out other people's rights to it, then I can tell you there's not many other things that you regard as fundamental rights to yourself that are going to be protected. So I would regard that as a bulwark, honestly, if I didn't have any religious beliefs. But I'd also tell them that they're standing in a tradition that goes way back. The Flushing Remonstrance involved people protecting religious rights that they didn't believe. So really, if you're protecting the rights of a Quaker, and that in its day is regarded as an extreme and crazy practice, that's not dramatically different from standing up when you believe that there is no God, that there is no religious duty that's compelled other than in one's imagination. Any religious belief might seem crazy, but so did Quakerism seem crazy to those who were living in Flushing. So did Mormonism seem crazy to people. Jehovah's Witness seemed crazy to people. And in all those instances, one way to ensure that all rights are protected is to start with those that are regarded as most fundamental to our fellow citizen.